see, I think, because she lives right below us, but that's him, and he has so many antics that I think we can fill a book very easily with him. So that's what we'll be doing. So last time we talked about the Stamp Act crisis. This time we're going to focus on the Earl of Hillsborough and the Hillsborough years. That would be 1768 and 1769, which were very tumultuous and were similar in many ways to 1968 and 1969, for those of you who may remember those years. So the lecture next time is going to be called the Bobsled Ride, which is a period of time where it seems like there was a very sharp descent into chaos on the part of the conflict between the Americans and their mother country. But in the period that we're talking about a rather placid time with 2 years of incredible volatility. And the Earl of Hillsborough was at the center of most of it. But before we get into that, we have some unfinished business with the Stamp Act. Because while we covered all the bases, I think, in terms of the process and who did what and how the colonists resisted and everything, and how this ended up in a repeal of the Stamp Act, probably the most important part is that we need to take a moment and step back and see what the colonists learned from this experience. And that's what I would like to spend a few moments doing, because I made the assertion that I felt that this was the very first battle of the American Revolution. And I think you only see that when you step back and you look at what the colonists learned that they will be applying in the future. So we have an advantage. We kind of know what they are going to do down the road. So there's 5 things that I want to highlight. And if I can just, I think they're all, yeah. The first thing that they learned was that it was a good idea to form a Congress of all the other colonies. They had never done this before. England had ordered them to a Congress about 10 years earlier, but this was something they did on their own. They decided to call a Congress of all the other colonies. There was nothing in their charters that gave them the authority to do this just because they were objecting to the king. They decided that this was their right, and they decided it on the basis of John Locke's theories of contract theories and social contracts. So we talked about John Locke before. So it's pretty clear that it was ingrained, and they believed they had the right to consider an alternate strategy. The second thing kind of flows right out of the first, and that is when they met. There were only 9 of the 13 met. They discovered they liked one another and could work together. Not only that, many of them continued correspondence with one another afterwards. There we go. Hopefully that'll stay on now. The most famous of this was the radicals in Boston. Sam Adams, the leader of those, met Christopher Gadsden from South Carolina and Richard Henry Lee, from Virginia. And those 3 corresponded with one another on a regular basis, updating their respective colonies on what was going on in the other. This is the seedling, I believe, for what eventually became committees of correspondence, which would in fact become a major tool of the American Revolution, but also in the French and Dutch revolutions that were to come later on. So it was an important learning experience for them. Thirdly, they learned that boycotts work. They probably didn't know that for sure until they actually did a boycott of British goods. And when they did, it caused massive unemployment. It put a lot of pressure on members of Parliament, and many of the workers fortuitously blamed Parliament rather than the Americans when it came to the Stamp Act. So they found they have a winning strategy if they pursue boycotts. The fourth item is particularly touchy, you might say, and that's violence. There was violence applied, but what was particularly interesting about the violence in this period of the American Revolution was that it was like a controlled intimidation. It was targeted to only specific individuals. In Boston, for example, they had one day of rioting, and then 12 days later, another day of rioting, but they only went after select officials, people that agreed, primarily people that agreed to, try to keep this on maybe, people that agreed to administer the Stamp Act, and they got them to resign. They got them to resign by, in some cases, tearing apart their homes, and in other cases, threatening to tear apart their homes. But the ultimate result was success in that all the Stamp Act administrators did in fact resign, either because of one, either they had their homes threatened or they were in fact torn apart. So this was all part of their strategy. And as I said, that will also be a tool of the future, targeted intimidation of opponents. As compared to running wild in the streets, burning and looting everybody, just they picked a few targets and went after those. The last thing to keep in mind is that they learned that opposition to the king works in their colonies. And by that I mean that shortly after the Stamp Act, or even before it was repealed, elections were held in Virginia and in Massachusetts, which I explained were the two largest colonies and by far the most influential colonies. And in each case, the moderates lost when there was a call for a new election, and the radicals took over in both of those states. So it was a winning issue for the Patriots if they decided to try to brand somebody as an enemy of state for supporting the king's policies. So that's a lot to learn, and that's a lot that would be applied. So with that in mind, I'd like to switch to the Hillsborough years. Oops. And I guess the thing I need to do now, when you look at this 2-year period of time, it's like an 8-ring circus, not a 3-ring circus. There's a lot of chaos, it's all going on in different places. To help keep it in place in my own mind, and maybe yours I hope, I decided to try to talk from different locations depending on whether we were talking about what's going on in London, or talking about what's going on in Boston, or what's going on in the other colonies, because they all play a huge role in this. Now this umbrella, it rains a lot in London, so when I stand near here, we're in London, okay? When I stand over by my 6-pack of Sam Adams, Boston, very good. So, this one is a little trickier because we have a cowbell, and this is for all the other colonies, and it changes who the more important influence is. For example, sometimes when I'm here, I'll be Philadelphia, sometimes I'll be Virginia, other times I'll be just like all the other colonies at large, because the effects of these events were different in all of these different places. Now I particularly like the umbrella for London because when I'm standing here, you need to keep 2 things in mind. First of all, I'm like 3,000 miles away from everything. If I want to communicate or I want to, the one thing I know is that all the information I get is 2 months old. Because it takes 2 months for the information, proclamations, whatever, to get from London to America. So when you're acting on data that's 2 months old. Also, an interesting trait of all of the secretaries of state for the colonies from Britain is none of them had ever been to the Americas. Hillsborough had never been, but he wasn't an exception to that rule. These people that were the decision makers calling all of the shots, it's nice to be the decision maker, but not so nice when all your information is old and when you've never been there yourself, so you don't really know what you're getting into. To me, it sounded like a recipe for disaster, and you can make your own call as we describe what's going on. And in fact, it's in London where we'll begin our conversation. Because in London, the Americans felt that they were in good shape as far as any future threats to their liberties. because the new prime minister was William Pitt. Now you might recall that William Pitt was their chief spokesperson, their primary advocate during the Stamp Act crisis. He was eloquent beyond belief, he was very effective, and he in fact became the next prime minister. So they figured, as long as he's in charge, we don't have anything to fear. And his policies would be pro-American all the way up to 1774, till he died. So the question then becomes, ¿qué pasa? What happened? What went awry? What Americans unfortunately did not know was that their hero Pitt, who was a genius, a charismatic man, he was an amazing person. He was 58 years old. He's getting older, and he had been suffering his entire life from very severe bouts of gout. So, on top of that, he inherited manic depression from his grandfather. And so, sadly, no sooner did he start his ministry than he got hit with another serious bout of both of these, but even more perverse than usual, because as one got a little better, the other one got worse. He was in incredible pain, so much so that he had to leave his own ministry and go to Bath, which is a famous healing place in England where you go to take the waters in Bath in hopes of getting better. But the truth is, during his whole term, about 2 years, he was not there. He was in pain. His ministers tried to meet with him to get his approval on different things. He refused to meet with anybody. He refused to meet with the king. Who can do that? So it's a very sad situation that our hero found himself in, and yet, had he selected really strong cabinet members, had he done this, maybe things would have worked out a little better. But regrettably, he did not do a great job of picking his ministers. This is made very clear by his very good friend Edmund Burke. The two of them would be politically allied, almost forever. And Burke made these observations. He's a famous historian of the English Empire. Burke described Pitt's choice of ministers in 1766 as, quote, checkered and speckled. I love it, checkered and speckled. It's like two words that could mean anything, but I will give Burke credit. He went on to explain, in the same cabinet he had patriots and courtiers, king's friends and Republicans, Whigs and Tories. He says, indeed, a very curious show, you can almost hear him talking here, but utterly unsafe to touch. So, there was a vacuum in leadership that occurred. And one of the big problems that the British had was financial. And their top finance guy was a 41-year-old person named Champagne Charlie Townsend. And he was convinced that he could find a solution to the entire American problem. And so 9 months after the repeal, he was already trying to figure out a way to do this. And he came up with what he called a winning strategy. His idea was simple and yet very effective in many ways. His idea was to say, okay, the Americans say we can't tax directly like a Stamp Act, on stamps or any direct tax on them as individuals, but they have been paying customs duties since the beginning of time. So what we'll do is we'll just increase the number of customs duties and we'll start enforcing them more harshly. And when we do that, we'll bring in enough money so that we will be able to pay the salaries of all the governors, which were currently being paid by the Americans, all the lieutenant governors, all the judges, and the customs officers, which would give them very firm control over the entire royal apparatus. The Americans, you would think, might say, oh good, we'd like to not have to put this in our budgets. However, they knew that if the king paid all these salaries, that they would have no influence over the way court decisions were made. They were very sharp. They knew this, and they feared this very greatly. So I want to say a little bit more about tariffs. And there's William Pitt. I told you I always run it. I have my pictures here. Short history of American customs duties. They had in fact been paying customs duties for a long time. I'm supposed to stay near this umbrella, aren't I? 1710 to 62, they had customs duties mainly on sugar, a few other items, and they were not enforced to any degree. And this coincides with the Newcastle period that I told you about before, where England and America had a good working relationship and policy, and Lord Newcastle, who was pretty much running England during this period of time, didn't want to provoke them, and so he did put a lot of extra energy into trying to enforce the law. In 1762, as you might recall, we had a turnover in government. George III comes in, he kicks out all of the people, the Newcastle people, puts his own people in, and at the same time has 44 warships to do enforcement of the customs duties to bring more money in. So in that context, the 1767 Townshend Acts kind of makes some sense. They just added 4 more items to tax. Tea is one of them, paint, glass, lead. The other biggie though is the enforcement headquarters would be in Boston, and there would be hell to pay for that as it would work out. So that was the plan, and it was passed in July, and it was not learned of until September. Here's some of the people that are going to be involved: John Wilkes, the Earl of Hillsborough, Samuel Adams, John Dickinson, and George Washington all play roles. Now, John Dickinson was from Pennsylvania, so I'll try to be over here. John Dickinson is one of our primary founding fathers. He was one of the greatest, yet he's not the first to pop to mind, maybe because he never became president. I'm not really sure why. But beginning in 1768, with his publication of the letters from a Pennsylvania farmer, he became the leader of Americans up until 1776. The Americans were mainly moderate in the Continental Congress, and he was their leader. And it began, like I said, with these important letters. I need to say that he was in no way a farmer. He was actually one of the most wealthy men in Pennsylvania. His father was a lawyer. He was a lawyer. His wife was a Quaker, and his mother was a Quaker, but he was not. I say this for you, Kathleen. So the thing that he came out with is that he totally unified the Americans. The doctrines that he recommended, the letters from a Pennsylvania farmer were 1 letter a week that were published everywhere, and for a total of 12 letters, so we're talking about 3 months worth of letters. And they were published in every newspaper. They were actually the bestseller in America until Tom Paine came along with Common Sense. In it, he came up with a simple strategy, which as a well-known moderate was very effective. He argued, and he had been educated in Middle Temple in London, which is the very best law school in England. He had been educated there, and what he argued was, first, that England, Parliament, had no right to tax the Americans at all, whether it was customs duties, whether it was anything else. And he was very effective and lucid on that subject. And that was important because Americans were not sure what to make of this new tax, because it was raising a lot of money, but it was raising money by a tax they'd always paid in the past. So he came out and argued that no, we shouldn't have been doing this. We can only be taxed if we have our consent. And the thing that really won Americans over is he also, because he was a moderate, argued for a nonviolent strategy. He said, what should we do? Only 2 things. 1, keep sending petitions and resolutions to make them know that we object to this policy of theirs. And number 2, we'll boycott all the British goods that were mentioned, the lead, the tea, whatever, and we'll start making it ourselves here. That was his strategy. And the country had probably never been so unified before. They all bought into it. Even Sam Adams bought into it. Well, I'm standing by him already, I guess so. Sam Adams jumped on this strategy, even though he would have preferred maybe a more radical response. He got it published in the Boston Gazette and all the newspapers in New England. And he began to endorse this very thoroughly. So by the time of February, he had already done two things. He had already organized all the Boston merchants to do a boycott, and they all agreed to do it. And he managed to do this without the governor even knowing it, so he couldn't notify London that this was going on. And the other thing he did was he sent a circular out. He got the Massachusetts legislature to do this, to send out a circular to all the other colonies saying, hey, what Dickinson wrote really makes a lot of sense. We should try to coordinate our response together. And so that's what he did. Now, Sam Adams is a very interesting character. I never knew quite how I felt about him until I read a book by Ira Stoll on his biography. And you may find yourself thinking a little differently about him as well. This is from my second book, the one on roots, and it's just one paragraph I'd like to read to you. Sam's most important gift was writing. He could clearly and concisely synthesize the ideas of himself and others. He wrote many articles for the Boston Gazette under 6 or more different names. Think about that. 6 or more different names, each with a unique persona, dialect, and personality. That takes an awful lot, I think, to be able to do that. I'm lucky if I can do one personality, so. Then Ira Stoll goes on, he says, Adams also took turns every week with the manual labor required to operate a creaking, groaning, 6 foot high, 6 foot wide device of wood and string and iron, by which one sheet of paper at a time was pressed up against a form of inked type. The truth is, the power of the press in those days came from the human back and arm and shoulder muscles. And he was physically doing the work. He wasn't just writing, he was getting his fingernails dirty in the printing industry, and he was working hard at it. And it's also the case that John Adams was with him. By 1769, it was no secret that the two Adamses, they were cousins, 11 years apart, and the two Gazette publishers, quote, go regularly every Saturday to set the press. So I see him differently. I hope you see him a little differently, as a very hardworking, diligent individual. And he would have a big impact on this, because that little circular that he sent out, you might think, what's the big deal? Nothing in it, there's nothing violent, so what's wrong with it? Well, in London, they felt differently. And I need to go to my London stuff. Oh, I got it here. We're going to talk a little bit about the Earl of Hillsborough, and I can stand here while doing it, I believe. So, the new decision maker for London was Wills Hill, the Earl of Hillsborough. He was just took over in January of '68. So right at the very, very beginning of all of this, he discovers, he's in charge. We know a bit about him, and I think it'd be more interesting for me to note to you that when I wrote this, I didn't live in Hillsborough County. I didn't know that Hillsborough County had any connection with the Earl of Hillsborough, and I probably didn't know that Tampa was in Hillsborough County at the time. I didn't connect them at all. So here's what I wrote in my ignorance of that fact. The title of the chapter was called The Madness Begins, 1768-79. In January of '68, with Pitt still nominally Prime Minister, Wills Hill, the Earl of Hillsborough, became Secretary of State for the colonies. He was 50 years old, undistinguished, but familiar with colonial issues. He inherited very large estates in County Down, Ireland, and in England as well. He became very wealthy because of the accompanying rental income. And with those properties came 5 seats in Parliament. I had no idea you could do that. If you were a head of House of Lords and your land included these 5 positions, you could pretty much appoint who was going to be members of Parliament for those 5. So anyway, he himself was a Newcastle Whig. He rose up the ranks rather slowly, but he did in fact rise up the ranks. This was surprising to the historian Sir Robert Walpole, who wrote that Hillsborough was, quote, a pompous composition of ignorance and poor judgment. And Benjamin Franklin agreed. Now Benjamin is usually pretty even-handed in his evaluations, but not with Hillsborough. He described him as wrong-headed, as a man of wrong-headed, bustling energy, and extremely conceited of his own political knowledge and abilities, such as they are, in parentheses. So, the thing that makes all the difference probably is that King George actually agreed. King George said, this is later when he's making an evaluation, King George agreed. He noted that in his service, quote, no man has shown poorer judgment than Hillsborough. So this seems like a pretty caustic judgment, and it made me wonder, why did we name this county after him? You know? So I did a little research. Let's see. I think it's on the slide, if I can find my little slide number.
It's right there, by your Samuel Adams.
So, oh, thank you. Thank you very much. So I think, so there's Sam Adams, Earl of Hillsborough. In fairness, I'm not going to go into this, but John Wilkes returned and caused total chaos in England. They threw him in jail, and he was in the midst of all of this, but we won't do that today. So anyway, I looked it up and said, well, when was Hillsborough County created? It was created in 1834 by a gentleman named Augustus Steele, who was trying to establish the city of Tampa. And to do that, you had to get county boundaries approved first. So he went in and he got county boundaries approved for a Hillsborough County that's way larger than, it must be 6 or 8 of the counties now go all the way down to Sarasota County would have been in it. So it was a big terrain that he picked out. Why did he pick Hillsborough? Because it was at the, Tampa would be at the junction of the Hillsborough River and Hillsborough Bay, which raises a question, how did they get those names? Why did we pick it in 1830s that's what those were called? So I dug a little further and I discovered it all goes back to the 1760s, when in 1763, as a result of the Treaty of Paris that ended the 7 Years' War, one of the little known provisions was that England, who had conquered Manila and Havana, gave both of them back to the Spanish, and in return, the Spanish gave Florida to England. They didn't really probably know what to do with it exactly, and we don't know a lot about that period of time, but we do know they took a survey. So, and this is what you do when you conquer a new place. You immediately survey it to see what resources are there, to try to learn, okay, we got this, what's there? And so they hired some surveyors to do this, and it turns out that the Secretary of State for the colonies is the guy who hires the people that do the survey. And in 1769, while Hillsborough was Secretary of State, we have the very first map that we can find that was in English. It was an English map in which they named Hillsborough Bay and Hillsborough River. So that's how they got their name, and probably the reason why it was chosen was because their boss's name was Hillsborough, and he controlled their pension and their salaries, and so probably thought it was wise to name something after him. So that's the way it looks, and it's a intriguing story. But we should probably, now that we understand a little bit about how Hillsborough County got its name and what all was involved, I think what we want to do now is to talk about, he really didn't do all that much that was terrible. He made all his quote unquote mistakes in April. Word of Sam Adams, the Massachusetts Circular, which was passed in February, didn't get to him till mid-April. And what he did, he hit the roof. He was furious. This was outrageous that they would do this, and he was gonna put a stop to it. And so his idea was to immediately send a letter to the governor of Massachusetts and order him to tell the Massachusetts legislature to rescind the circular that they had approved. And then he came up with the idea, and if they didn't rescind it, he would shut down the legislature, he would dissolve. Royal governors had the policy, had the authority to shut down a legislature if they wanted to. So that was there. The other thing he did was, since it would turn out to be a bad idea, he said he could make a bad idea worse by then taking a similar circular and sending it to all the other 12 colonies who may have gotten the Massachusetts circular, and ordered them to formally reject the Massachusetts circular. And if they didn't do it, their governors were ordered to shut down the assemblies, just like that. It caused quite a bit of consternation. I'm gonna go back over here. I'm gonna separate the problem by talking about the Boston side of it separately from the rest of the colonies. So over here. The order to rescind the Massachusetts legislature was too late in 4 colonies who had already approved it. One of them was Virginia. Virginia sent out a circular of its own to all the other colonies. So it was really quite too late. Eventually, all of the colonies would refuse to rescind or to attack the Massachusetts circular. Most of them agreed with it, so all 12. So it was a complete failure in terms of getting any action. 5 governors followed through on the order to shut down the legislature. And that's kind of where the rub would come. Before we get to that, though, we need to look on the very peculiar impact on Boston, because they, of course, got a circular order to their governor. But in the meantime, things were changing very, very dramatically. You might remember that they set up the headquarters for the customs offices in Boston. The people found that the customs officers were treated with incredible hostility and snubbing. One of them complained because people here have no respect for social rank, was his phrasing. No respect for social rank. And really, they didn't kill anybody or bloody anybody up, but they had mobs almost every day going to the homes of all of these customs officers and shouting and hanging people in effigy and what have you, just to make it a very menacing situation. When the governor tried to make it a little better by having a welcoming ceremony for them, he asked John Hancock, who employed about 1,000 seamen, and he also was the head of the band, if they would play music for this welcoming ceremony that they were going to have for all these customs officers. No way. He absolutely refused, and they had to do it without music. And of course, they were very upset. They were clearly snubbed. I mean, there's no question about it. They were treated like lions at a wildebeest convention, if you can imagine that. Total hostility. And this kind of, nothing had broken out in total violence yet. So while all this other stuff is going on, in April, these customs officers decide to get even with Hancock, and they confiscate one of his brigs, take it to court. They lose in court. Then they take another vessel, and this is on June 10th. They take another vessel, and Hancock's people were ready for it. They actually had armed seamen to oppose what turned out to be the British Navy came in with a 40-gun warship in order to protect it, and they hauled his ship, the Lydia, out into a place called Castle Island, which is in the middle of the harbor, and was protected. Well, all rules were off. Once that happened, the Americans who had lost this battle with the British Navy were furious, and they did in fact run around the streets looking for customs officers to beat up and houses to burn and everything, and they just totally, this is now the Sons of Liberty, is what they started to call themselves. They completely take over the city so that they are governing it from about June 10th to June 17th or so. And by June 17th, all of the customs offices and all the royal offices have hightailed it out of Boston, and they're hiding in Castle Island, and that's where they're living. And they've totally lost their ability to do anything. So this is the setting, June 17th, of what the conditions were when Hillsborough's order arrives on June 21st. Hillsborough now is ordering the governor. Imagine yourself the governor. You have totally lost control of your chief city. You have very questionable control of anything else going on in Massachusetts, and you now have an order from your boss saying you've got to get the Massachusetts legislature to retract what they did. That's not likely to happen, and he knows it. And so he gives the order like he's supposed to, and the Massachusetts legislature pretends they're going to seriously consider this, but they vote 92 to 14 to not rescind their legislation. He orders them dissolved. And what do you think happened when he dissolved them? They just called their own convention. They just did it themselves. They said, we don't need your formal legislature. We're going to just take care of this ourselves. We're going to work out our own strategies, and we're just going to create our own legislature. Now, this is an amazing precedent. This is the first time they did that. They will do it many years hence. But it's John Locke's theory of social contract, state of nature, that you have the right to withdraw from any government that exists, that is revocable. And so this was an amazing first step, and it's a breakthrough that's created here. Meanwhile, in Virginia, and I think I'm closing things up here, because even though it's important what Hillsborough did in terms of being totally, embarrassed by the response of all the other 12 colonies, who none of them would endorse his retraction of their retraction, would not retract the Massachusetts Circular. That's a big disaster. And certainly what happened in Massachusetts is a big disaster for the British as well. But maybe the biggest disaster was Virginia, because they woke a sleeping giant. I'm going to just put George Washington up here. Well, I should probably mention this too, I think. After the next set of elections that occurred after this, whereas two, Massachusetts and Virginia, had flipped to radical control, by the end of Hillsborough, you can see 6 more are added, so that radicals have taken over 6 more colonies, which is big. But I think it's even bigger that George Washington started to get interested in all of this. And if I put my little... He had not paid much attention to the Stamp Act. He thought the British had just made a stupid mistake and would recognize it pretty quickly, and that was somewhat borne out in how quickly they did repeal the Stamp Act. But he took the Townshend Act much more seriously, and he, in fact, was one of the 2 leaders of the movement to boycott British goods in Virginia. He and George Mason, his neighbor, worked together on all of this. And it would come to pass eventually that the legislature would be dissolved, and Virginia, like Massachusetts, would hold their own private meeting and approve the boycott agreement. In other words, govern themselves without the House of Burgesses that was created by the governor, start in the direction of independence. But the most important part may well be that George, and I want to talk next time more about George Washington, but for now, because I think we're running a bit late, for George, the breakthrough was the fact that the governors of 3 of the top 4 states had already dissolved their legislatures. We're talking Massachusetts, we're talking Maryland, and Virginia. And when this happened, it became clear to him that there was a threat to liberty, and he wrote the following to a good friend. When our lordly masters in Great Britain will be satisfied with nothing less than the deprivation of American freedom, something should be done to maintain the liberty which we have derived from our ancestors. Also, by the end of '69, he was hinting to friends that if need be, he was ready to wear the uniform again. So, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Thank you.
Thank you.